When my grandfather Hollis found a starving little girl crying by his water trough at dawn, he had no idea that feeding her one bowl of soup would save his entire family from a fate worse than death. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. The story begins with the power of an impossible choice made in a split second. Picture this: February 1884, Montana Territory, where the nearest neighbor lives 15 miles away and winter kills as surely as bullets. My grandfather, Hollis Brannigan, had already buried his son and daughter-in-law to cholera, leaving him to raise my 8-year-old mother Verity alone on 2,000 acres of cattle ranch that felt more like a target than a home. Hollis wasn't a soft man. 3 generations of Brannigans had carved their living from this unforgiving land, and he'd learned early that sentiment could get you killed. At 45, his hands were scarred from barbed wire and his face weathered by decades of Montana, sun and wind. He stood 6'2" in his worn leather boots with steel-gray eyes that missed nothing and trusted less. The territorial governor once called him fair but firm, which in those days meant he'd give you an honest deal, but wouldn't hesitate to put a bullet in you if you crossed him. Verity was all he had left of family, a bright-eyed girl with her mother's auburn curls and her father's stubborn streak. Since the cholera outbreak took her parents 8 months earlier, she'd grown quieter, more watchful, as if she understood that their world balanced on the edge of a knife. She could already shoot a rifle well enough to hit a tin can at 50 yards, because in their world, even 8-year-olds needed to know how to protect themselves. Their ranch sat in a valley that should have been paradise but felt more like a trap. Rolling grassland stretched for miles, bordered by pine-covered hills that could hide an army. The house itself was built of thick logs with gun ports cut into the walls, because Hollis's brother who built it understood that beauty and safety didn't always go hand in hand. This was the winter when everything changed. 3 neighboring ranches had been burned to the ground in the past month, their families either killed or driven off by Blackfoot war parties, angry over broken treaty promises. Smoke signals had been spotted on the surrounding hills for weeks. Every night Hollis would barricade the doors and windows, knowing that if the attacks came, he and Verity would be on their own until help could arrive from town, if help came at all. But on that February morning, when frost covered everything in crystalline death and the air was so cold it burned your lungs, Hollis had no idea that his greatest test of character was waiting by his water trough. He certainly never imagined that the choice he was about to make would determine whether he and Verity lived to see another winter, or if their story would end in flames and blood like so many others before them. The sun was just breaking over the eastern hills, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and pink that would have been beautiful if they hadn't highlighted how exposed and vulnerable the ranch really was. To understand what happened that morning, you need to know how Hollis and Verity got to that point of desperation. 8 months earlier, cholera had swept through the territory like wildfire through dry grass, and within 2 weeks, Hollis lost his younger brother Thomas and sister-in-law Catherine, leaving behind only Verity. The girl had watched her parents die in agony, burning with fever while their bodies rejected everything they tried to keep down. Hollis had dug their graves himself in the family cemetery on the hill overlooking the ranch, because the preacher was too scared to make the trip during the outbreak. Hollis never expected to be a father figure at 45, but life rarely asks your permission before it changes everything. Thomas had been the dreamer, the one with grand plans for expanding their cattle operation and building bridges with the territorial government. Hollis was the practical one, the protector who understood that sometimes you had to fight for what was yours. Now he found himself trying to be both parents to a girl who still woke up screaming for her mama 3 nights a week. The ranch itself told the story of 3 generations of Brannigan blood and sweat. Hollis's father had claimed this land in 1861, building the original cabin with his own hands, while fighting off claim jumpers and harsh winters that killed livestock and dreams with equal indifference. Thomas had expanded it, adding the barn, the bunkhouse, and the main house where they now lived. Every board, every fence post, every stone in the foundation represented years of backbreaking work and sacrifice. But by February 1884, that legacy felt more like a burden than a blessing. The winter had been brutal even by Montana standards, with temperatures dropping so low that cattle froze standing up, and the sound of tree branches cracking in the cold echoed like gunshots across the valley. Their food stores were running dangerously low, and with the territorial roads blocked by snow, there was no way to get supplies until spring thaw. Worse than the cold was the fear. The Blackfoot had every right to be angry. Government promises had been broken so many times that the treaties weren't worth the paper they were written on, and desperate people do desperate things. Hollis knew some of the neighboring ranchers had been stealing cattle and selling rifles to hostile tribes, creating a powder keg that was bound to explode. When the Hendersons' ranch burned 3 weeks ago, Hollis found their bodies frozen in the snow, scalped and mutilated in ways that still haunted his dreams. Every morning, Hollis would wake before dawn and climb to the roof to scan the surrounding hills for smoke signals or the glint of sunlight off weapons. He'd taught Verity to recognize the signs too, because if trouble came, she needed to be ready. Their daily routine had become a careful dance of survival, checking the cattle, maintaining their weapons, rationing their food, and always watching the horizon. "Grandpa, why don't we just leave?" Verity had asked him just 2 nights before that fateful morning. They were sitting by the fire after another sleepless night of jumping at every sound outside. Hollis had looked at her serious little face and felt his heart break a little. "This land is all we got, little one. Your daddy and your uncle, they're buried up on that hill. Your great-grandpa, too. A man doesn't just walk away from 3 generations of family blood in the soil." But privately, he was beginning to wonder if his pride was going to get them both killed. The smart thing would have been to pack up and head east to Kansas, where his other brother lived. But Hollis Brannigan had never been accused of being overly smart. He was stubborn, loyal to a fault, and believed that a man should stand his ground, no matter what the cost. That stubbornness was about to be tested in ways he never could have imagined. That February morning started like every other for the past 3 weeks. Hollis woke in the darkness before dawn, his hand instinctively reaching for the loaded Colt .45 he kept on the nightstand. The house was silent except for Verity's soft breathing from the next room and the constant whistle of wind through the eaves. He dressed quickly in the cold, pulling on his heavy coat and boots before stepping outside to do the morning chores that could mean the difference between life and death. The cold hit him like a physical blow, so intense it made his eyes water, and his lungs burn with each breath. The thermometer nailed to the porch post read 28 below zero. In weather like this, a man could freeze to death in minutes if he wasn't careful, and cattle could die just from the shock of drinking ice-cold water too fast. Hollis made his way to the barn first, checking on their remaining livestock. They'd lost 6 head of cattle to the cold already this winter, and he couldn't afford to lose any more. The animals huddled together for warmth, their breath creating clouds of steam in the frigid air. He broke the ice on their water troughs with an axe, the sharp cracks echoing across the silent valley like rifle shots. That's when he heard it, a soft whimpering sound, so quiet he almost missed it over the wind. At first, he thought it might be a wounded animal, maybe a coyote caught in one of his traps. But as he moved closer to the main water trough near the house, the sound became clearer. It was crying, human crying. Hollis drew his pistol and approached cautiously, his heart hammering against his ribs. In the dim pre-dawn light, he could barely make out a small shape huddled against the wooden trough. As he got closer, his blood ran cold. It was a child, a native girl who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, curled up in a ball and shaking uncontrollably from the cold. She was barely alive. Her lips were blue-black with frostbite, her bare feet were white as snow, and she was wearing nothing but a torn doeskin dress that offered no protection against the killing cold. Ice crystals had formed in her long black hair, and when she looked up at him with enormous dark eyes, Hollis saw something that hit him harder than any bullet ever could. She wasn't just cold and hungry. She was utterly, completely alone. Every instinct screamed at him to back away. This could be a trap, a way to lure him into the open where hidden warriors could pick him off. Even if it wasn't a trap, helping her was still potentially a death sentence. If this girl belonged to one of the hostile bands, taking her in could be seen as an act of war. If she died on his property, her people might blame him for her death. Either way, he and Verity could end up dead. But looking down at this child, barely conscious and moments away from freezing to death, Hollis felt something crack inside his chest. She reminded him so much of Verity, not just in age, but in that look of complete vulnerability. This was somebody's daughter, somebody's granddaughter, and she was dying right in front of him. His hands shook as he holstered his gun and knelt down beside her. "Hey there, little one," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Can you hear me?" She looked up at him with those huge eyes, and he saw recognition there, and fear, but also hope. She was conscious enough to be afraid, which meant she was conscious enough to be saved. The sound of the back door opening made him spin around. Verity appeared on the porch in her nightgown and bare feet, her auburn hair wild from sleep. "Grandpa, what's wrong? I heard voices." "Get back inside and get dressed," Hollis called to her, his voice sharper than he intended. "And put the coffee on. We're going to need it." As Verity disappeared back into the house, Hollis looked down at the native girl again. He was about to make a choice that would change everything, and he knew it. But sometimes a man doesn't get to choose between right and wrong. Sometimes he only gets to choose between wrong and worse. He gathered the girl into his arms, shocked by how light she was, how fragile. Her skin was like ice against his hands. "Come on, little one," he murmured, carrying her toward the house. "Let's get you warm." The next 18 hours changed everything Hollis thought he knew about courage, fear, and what it meant to be human. He carried the girl inside and laid her on the sofa near the fireplace, her body so cold it felt like holding a bundle of frozen sticks. Verity appeared in the doorway, fully dressed now, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. "Is she going to die, Grandpa?" Verity whispered, and Hollis heard the fear in her voice. This child had already watched her parents die. She didn't need to see another death. "Not if I can help it," Hollis replied, though privately he wasn't sure. Severe frostbite could kill as surely as a bullet, just slower and more painfully. They worked together to save her life. Verity heated water while Hollis carefully removed the girl's frozen doeskin dress and wrapped her in every blanket they owned. Her feet were the worst, white and hard as marble, and Hollis knew that even if she lived, she might lose her toes. He'd seen frostbite before, and it wasn't forgiving. As the warmth gradually returned to her body, the girl began to regain consciousness. Her eyes fluttered open, and when she saw Hollis leaning over her, she tried to scramble away, terror written across her face. "Easy there, little one," Hollis said softly, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're safe. We're going to take care of you." She didn't understand English, but his tone seemed to calm her slightly. Verity approached with a bowl of warm broth, and the smell made the girl's stomach growl audibly. She was starving. It took most of the morning, but slowly the girl's story began to emerge through gestures, broken English words, and drawings scratched in the dirt by the fireplace. Her name was Nalani, which she managed to communicate by pointing to herself and repeating it over and over. She drew pictures of people turning away from her, of being driven out, of walking alone through the snow for days. The breakthrough came when Verity noticed something that made her gasp. "Grandpa, look at her eyes." Hollis looked closer and saw what Verity had spotted. Nalani had heterochromia, one eye brown and one eye green, a rare condition that made her appearance striking and unusual. Through more gestures and primitive drawings, the terrible truth emerged. Nalani had been born with her different-colored eyes, and some members of her tribe believed it marked her as cursed, touched by evil spirits. When sickness struck their camp and several children died, the superstitious blamed Nalani. Her mother had died defending her, and her father, though he loved her, was forced by tribal pressure to cast her out. "She's just like me, Grandpa," Verity said quietly, tears streaming down her face. "She's all alone, too. Her mama and daddy are gone, just like mine." That innocent observation hit Hollis like a punch to the gut. Here were two 8-year-old girls, both orphaned by circumstances beyond their control, both depending on him to keep them alive. The difference in their skin color suddenly seemed meaningless compared to their shared humanity. But even as his heart went out to Nalani, Hollis's practical mind was working overtime. He'd been watching the hills through the windows all day, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Fresh horse tracks circled the property, and smoke signals were rising from multiple points around the valley. Someone was definitely watching them, and more people were coming. As night fell, Hollis made a decision that went against every survival instinct he'd developed over 45 years of frontier life. Instead of sending Nalani away, he was going to protect her. He loaded every rifle, pistol, and shotgun in the house, arranged them strategically around the main room, and checked his ammunition supplies. "What are you doing, Grandpa?" Verity asked as she watched him prepare for war. Hollis knelt down so he was at her eye level, his hands on her small shoulders. "Sometimes doing what's right isn't the same as doing what's safe, little one. Your grandmother always said a man's character isn't measured by how he treats his friends, but by how he treats those who can't defend themselves." He spent the evening teaching both girls how to hide in the root cellar if fighting started, showing them the secret passage he'd built years ago that led from the cellar to the barn. If the worst happened, maybe they could escape while he held off whatever was coming. But as he looked at their faces in the firelight, Nalani and Verity sitting close together sharing a blanket, he realized he'd already made his choice. Some things were worth fighting for, even if it meant dying for them. Hollis didn't sleep that night. He sat in a chair by the front window, rifle across his knees, watching the distant campfires flicker on the surrounding hills like fallen stars. By his count, there had to be at least 200 warriors out. There, maybe more. Enough to turn his ranch into a graveyard within minutes if they decided to attack. Dawn came slowly, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. As the sun crested the eastern hills, Hollis heard it first as a low rumble, like distant thunder. Then the sound grew louder, more distinct. Horses, hundreds of them. He moved to the window and felt his heart stop. They were coming from every direction, a sea of mounted warriors flowing down from the hills like water breaking through a dam. Blackfoot braves in war paint and feathers, their ponies' breath steaming in the cold air, weapons glinting in the morning light. They moved with the precision of a military unit, spreading out to completely surround the ranch. "Dear God," Hollis whispered, gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles went white. The sound of hoofbeats woke Verity and Nalani, who came running from the back room still in their nightgowns. When they saw the massive force outside, Verity grabbed Hollis's arm. "Grandpa, what do we do?" Before he could answer, the warriors stopped. They formed a perfect circle around the property, sitting motionless on their horses like statues. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any war cry could have been. Then, from the center of the formation, a single rider emerged. He was a giant of a man, easily 6.5 feet tall, wearing a magnificent war bonnet with eagle feathers that trailed behind him in the wind. War paint covered half his face in intricate patterns, and a massive tomahawk hung from his belt alongside a rifle that looked like it could drop a buffalo at 200 yards. This had to be Thunder Bear, Nalani's father. The great chief dismounted, slowly, deliberately, his movements conveying both power and controlled fury. He walked toward the house alone, each step measured and purposeful. When Nalani saw him through the window, she let out a cry that was half joy, half terror. "Papa," she whispered, pressing her face against the glass. Hollis felt his mouth go dry. This was it. This was how his story ended, and probably Verity's too. He'd known the risks when he decided to protect Nalani, but seeing 200 warriors arrayed against him made the reality hit home like a sledgehammer to the chest. But he'd made his choice. He opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, his rifle held low but ready. Nalani pushed past him and ran toward her father, her bare feet slipping on the icy ground. What happened next changed everything Hollis thought he knew about honor, justice, and the nature of human beings. Thunder Bear didn't sweep his daughter into his arms. Instead, he dropped to his knees in the snow and bowed his head before her, his massive frame shaking with emotion. When he looked up, there were tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "My daughter," he said in heavily accented English, his voice carrying across the silent valley. The spirits have spoken. Our medicine man dreamed of you 3 nights running. You were not cursed. You were chosen. Your different eyes see truth that others cannot." He stood slowly and turned to face Hollis, but instead of anger or hatred, his expression showed something completely unexpected. Respect. "You fed the one our fear made us abandon," Thunderbear continued, his voice growing stronger. "You showed mercy to a child when her own people showed her none. You have more honor than we did." Hollis felt the world tilt sideways. This wasn't going according to any scenario he'd imagined. Thunderbear gestured to the warriors surrounding them. "We came here to investigate. The ranchers who burned, they were stealing our cattle, selling guns to our enemies. Your name was on our list to check." He paused, looking down at Nalani, who was clinging to his leg. "But finding my daughter safe in your home, cared for and protected, this tells us everything we need to know about your character." The great chief extended his hand toward Hollis. "You showed courage when it would have been easier to show fear. You chose compassion when survival demanded cruelty. For this, Thunderbear offers you something no white man in this territory has ever received." Hollis found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "What's that?" "Our protection, our partnership, our promise that no harm will come to you or your family as long as grass grows and water flows." What happened in the weeks and months that followed that morning would reshape not just our family's destiny, but the entire Montana territory's understanding of what was possible between peoples who had been taught to see each other as enemies. Thunderbear's warriors didn't ride away after that dramatic confrontation. Instead, they established a semi-permanent camp in the valley, creating what became known throughout the territory as the Peace Valley. Word spread like wildfire that a white rancher and a Blackfoot war chief had formed an alliance built on mutual respect rather than fear, and people came from hundreds of miles away just to see it with their own eyes. The transformation was immediate and profound. Hollis's cattle, which had been dwindling due to harsh winters and rustler attacks, suddenly began thriving under the protection of Blackfoot scouts who knew every trail and hiding place in the territory. In return, Hollis shared his knowledge of cattle breeding and farming techniques, helping Thunderbear's people supplement their traditional hunting with sustainable agriculture. But the real miracle was watching Nalani blossom from a frightened, outcast child into a bridge between 2 worlds. Her unique eyes, once seen as a curse, became a symbol of her ability to see beyond the surface differences that divided people. She spent her days moving freely between the ranch house and the tribal camp, equally at home in both worlds and teaching others to do the same. Verity and Nalani became inseparable, true sisters in every way that mattered. They created their own language mixing English and Blackfoot words, taught each other their respective cultures, songs, and stories, and demonstrated to every adult who watched them that children don't see enemies where adults see threats. They see friends where adults see strangers. The impact rippled far beyond their small valley. Other settlers began seeking out Thunderbear's protection, not through force or fear, but through the same kind of mutual respect that Hollis had shown. The territorial governor himself visited twice, trying to understand how a simple act of feeding a hungry child had accomplished what decades of treaties and negotiations had failed to achieve. "How did you know?" the governor asked Hollis during his second visit. "How did you know she wasn't a trap, that helping her wouldn't get you killed?" Hollis thought about that question for a long time before answering. "I didn't know," he finally said. "I just knew that letting a child freeze to death on my doorstep would have killed something inside me that's worth more than my life." Years passed, and the Peace Valley became a model for coexistence that attracted families from both communities. Nalani grew up to become a translator and mediator, her childhood experience of being caught between worlds making her uniquely qualified to help others find common ground. She married a young cavalry officer who had come to study their community, and their children grew up speaking 3 languages and belonging fully to both cultures. Verity, my mother, often told me that watching Nalani's transformation taught her the most important lesson of her life. "Your great-grandfather didn't just save one little girl that morning," she would say. He saved the idea that people can be better than their fears, braver than their prejudices, and stronger together than they ever could be apart. When Hollis finally passed away at the age of 73, representatives from 12 different tribes attended his funeral alongside territorial officials and neighboring ranchers. Thunder Bear, now an old man himself, spoke at the service. "This man taught us that courage isn't the absence of fear," Thunder Bear said, his voice carrying across the crowded cemetery. "Courage is doing what's right even when you're terrified of the consequences." He fed a hungry child when he thought it might cost him his life, and in doing so, he showed us all what it means to be truly human. Today, more than a century later, the Brannigan Ranch still operates in that same valley, run by Thunder Bear and Nalani's descendants alongside my own family. The lesson remains as powerful now as it was then. Sometimes the smallest acts of compassion cast the longest shadows, and sometimes choosing love over fear can literally change the world. The little girl crying by a water trough became the seed of peace that grew into something beautiful and lasting. All because one man decided that his humanity mattered more than his safety.